The high-level diplomatic talks in Saudi Arabia this week have marked a notable shift in the ongoing efforts to end the war in Ukraine. For the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, the US and Russia have engaged in direct face-to-face negotiations, signalling a potential opening for diplomatic resolution. However, these talks have not been without controversy, particularly in the context of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's announcement that the UK is ready and willing to deploy peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. This has drawn a sharp rebuke from Moscow, which has warned that NATO forces operating under other flags are categorically unacceptable. The discussions in Riyadh, led by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, resulted in several key agreements nevertheless. Firstly, both nations have committed to forming high-level teams to address irritants in their bilateral relationship, including the restoration of diplomatic staffing levels at embassies. It's a notable shift from the previous policy of diplomatic isolation between Washington and Moscow. Secondly, the talks have produced an agreement to establish formal lines of communication regarding Ukraine, with separate US-Russia talks and separate US-Ukraine discussions expected to follow. And as a result, Zelensky is shortly on his way back to Saudi Arabia, or down to Saudi Arabia. Importantly, there's an express commitment to ending the war in a way that's enduring, sustainable and acceptable to all sides. However, as always, the devil will be in the detail. Lavrov's statement following the meeting was both conciliatory and defiant. He acknowledged that both sides had truly listened to each other and described the talks as very useful. However, he also reiterated Russia's unwavering position against NATO involvement in Ukraine, warning that any deployment of Western troops, even under the guise of peacekeeping, would be considered an escalation. This puts Starmer's announcement in a precarious position. The UK's stated willingness to send peacekeeping forces to Ukraine as part of a long-term security commitment was met with alarm in Moscow. And while Starmer emphasised that this decision was not taken lightly, Russia has already framed it as a direct threat. Now, while the US and Russia are engaged in these preliminary discussions, President Zelensky is due in Saudi Arabia later this week, where he will likely push for Ukrainian representation in any negotiations moving forward. Zelensky has repeatedly stated that no agreement can be reached without Kyiv at the table, and there are mounting concerns that separate US-Russia talks risk sidelining Ukraine's interests. Additionally, European leaders have expressed unease about the optics of a US-Russia dialogue that doesn't include them. French President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency meeting in Paris to discuss Europe's role in any future settlement, while European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen emphasised that the EU must be directly involved in any talks regarding Ukraine's future. Another level of complexity in these discussions is the involvement of Donald Trump. His team has expressed an eagerness to move quickly on negotiations, with Trump's national security advisor Mike Waltz stating that an endless war in Europe is not acceptable. Well, there we all agree. This aligns with Trump's past rhetoric on Ukraine, which has lent towards an accelerated peace progress, possibly, and here we disagree, at the expense of Ukrainian territorial integrity. Reports suggest that a Trump-Putin meeting was discussed, but is unlikely in the immediate future. Nevertheless, Trump's influence over US foreign policy, whether official or unofficial, cannot be ignored as negotiations unfold. And while the Riyadh talks represent a notable diplomatic shift, they are only the first step in what will be a long and complex process. The agreements to restore diplomatic staffing, open formal communication channels, engage in structured negotiations mark progress, but significant obstacles remain. Russia's firm stance on NATO troops, Ukraine's demand to be included in talks, Europe's insistence on having a seat at the table all complicate the path forward. And as President Zelensky heads to Saudi Arabia, the coming days will be crucial in determining whether these talks can move forward from tentative engagement to real negotiation. And meanwhile, Starmer's peacekeeping proposal has injected new tension into an already delicate situation, underscoring the high stakes involved. For now, what we can say about today's developments in Saudi Arabia is that they signal movement, but whether they lead to peace remains an open question.